Sitting on the couch, I stare into the warm, crackling flames of the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand. It's New Year's Eve, and my wife's gentle voice mixes with the soft background music playing from the speakers as she arranges the gifts. Though our kids have long outgrown toys, we've held on to the tradition of giving them presents on New Year's morning. These days, it's not dolls or action figures but gadgets, books, and clothes. The gifts may have changed, but the love behind them has stayed the same. I look over at her, and, like so many times before, she catches my eye just as I glance her way. We share a quiet smile, warm and familiar. My mind drifts back to a New Year's Eve from years past, and then even further, to a night 2 years before that, when a series of lucky and unlucky events ultimately brought Megan Foster into my life as my partner, then my wife. People say sometimes you have to go through hell to reach heaven, and I can say that was the truth for me. I went through a kind of hell I'd never wish on anyone, but without it, I wouldn't have Megan, and I wouldn't be the man I am today. So, here's my story, because I think there are lessons worth sharing. To the best of my understanding, there's only been one perfect man in the history of the world, and he was more than just a man. So, it makes sense that every one of us, somewhere along the line, has done something wrong, something that hurt another person. We've all made choices that could have earned us a fair share of judgment, especially from those who hold us accountable. And it's thanks to grace that we don't always end up paying for our often foolish decisions. In my own life, I set someone on a path they might never have chosen for themselves. I introduced Sarah Lewis to marijuana when we'd barely left high school. From that one reckless moment, she slowly spiraled down a path of addiction and self-destruction. Maybe it wouldn't have been so terrible if it had stopped there, but not long after, I got her pregnant. We got married, and before long, she'd given me 3 kids in just 4 years, 2 daughters and a son. It took nearly 8 years of marriage for me to finally realize who she'd become right under my nose. By the time I was free of her, I'd gone through most of my savings and all of my pride, left with scars that still run deep, both inside and out. My name's Adam Peterson, and at 47, I'm a whole lot wiser than I was at 21. I grew up in the suburbs outside a decent-sized city in the southeast. My family did well enough, and like a lot of kids, I tried to act cool. I was on the high school football team, though I mostly played on special teams back in junior varsity. Still, that didn't stop me from smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, or getting high. That was just what we did back then. You'd think that losing a close friend in my senior year of high school would have straightened me out, and for a little while, it did. I was still reeling from that loss when I met Jessica. We had a class together, and she sort of took me under her wing, like she sensed I was lost. She already had a boyfriend, a guy a year older, going to the local community college, but we started seeing each other, and before long, she'd left him for me. Looking back, that probably should have been a red flag, but I was so smitten, I didn't think twice. Jessica was a bit of a band geek, but she was affectionate in a way that really drew me in. She was tall, fairly attractive, with a figure that was, as they say, well put together. She used to feel a bit self-conscious about her nose, which had a slight crook to it, though to me, it never took away from her looks. Her hair was soft and brown, not particularly eye-catching, but nice in its own way. She was, by and large, a sweet girl, the youngest kid of a truck driver and a school teacher. But not everyone took to her, my dad included. Even before drugs came into the picture, Jessica had her share of moody spells, and when she was in a rough mood, well, she could be quite a handful. That was fine, really, because when I was in a lousy mood, I wasn't exactly easy to handle either. Even my mom, who liked Jessica and understood her, could see the risks of 2 personalities like ours getting together. My dad, on the other hand, seemed to sense that she had some hidden struggles that might eventually drag me down, and he believed I could probably find someone who'd be a better fit. But I was head over heels, and, besides, he'd married someone folks said was beneath him, and my mom turned out to be an absolute gem. Things between Jessica and me might have fizzled out on their own if I hadn't gone off to college and then come back for Thanksgiving break with a new enthusiasm for the wonders of weed. It was a Tuesday morning, my first day back home from college. Jessica's parents were both at work, so when I showed up at her door, she greeted me in a thin nightgown. We hadn't seen each other in a couple of months, so naturally, we were both thrilled. Still, I convinced her to throw on some clothes and take a ride with me. There was this spot where we'd parked together before, a favorite of ours, so I drove us there. Once parked, I pulled out a hefty joint. She looked a little uneasy at first, but I think she'd always been at least a little curious about it from the way I'd talked around it before, so she agreed to give it a try. It made her giggly, and then she turned on me with this kind of passion I'd never seen from her before. We'd been close before, sure, but it had often felt like she was holding back a bit. This time was different. She kissed me with wild intensity, and within seconds, we were tugging at each other's clothes like crazy. Now, I won't say the back seat of a car is the most comfortable place for that kind of affection, but it sure did make for an exciting experience. We were sweating, laughing hysterically, and slowly coming down from this incredible high. I quickly learned that we'd had the same effect on Jessica as it did on me. It made her incredibly affectionate. That whole weekend, whenever we had the chance, we were inseparable until I left on Sunday. Then Christmas vacation rolled around, and we spent most of it doing the same thing, though finding the time and place to be together wasn't always easy. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, and the longer we spent together over the break, the more friction built up. Jessica was so affectionate and quick to fall into old patterns that I eventually started to wonder what she'd been doing while I was away at college. When we weren't high and close, we were bickering, and it seemed like a breakup was inevitable until fate decided to step in. I'd been back at college for about a month into the spring semester when I got a call from Jessica, and she was crying. Her period was late, and after a visit to the clinic, the doctor confirmed what she'd feared: she was pregnant. Even though neither of us was particularly religious, we didn't believe in abortion, and after talking it over, we decided to get married. Our parents weren't exactly thrilled, especially my dad, who practically begged me to reconsider. But I felt it was the responsible choice, the honorable thing to do. So, in June of 1997, we got married. Later on, after our daughter Emily Peterson was born, I went over the timeline and figured out that Jessica must have gotten pregnant around New Year's Day. I'd end up doing the same kind of mental math for the other two kids as well. With a family to support, college was out of the question, so I took a job at an electronics store, working as a stocker and sometimes a cashier. Nowadays, I'd never have gotten that job without passing a drug test, but back then, they didn't require it, and I turned out to have a knack for the work. After a couple of years, I got promoted to assistant manager at a different branch in town, and by 2001, Jessica and I welcomed our son, Tyler Peterson. Just a year later, our youngest, Ava Peterson, was born. With that, Jessica decided to have her tubes tied, and we focused on raising our growing family. During those years, we knew how to have a good time but never got too out of hand. We'd smoke pot pretty regularly and occasionally splurge on some coke, hash, or even LSD. Jessica enjoyed the way some of those highs made her feel, and we'd always end up close and affectionate whenever we got high. But as the kids grew older and I took on more responsibilities, I found myself letting go of the harder stuff. Eventually, it faded out of my life altogether. I honestly thought Jessica had left it behind, too. I loved her deeply through all of it, even when things weren't exactly smooth at home. Then, in the fall of 2003, when Ava was 3 and Tyler 4, Jessica decided to go back to work, landing a job as a secretary at a mid-sized electrical contractor. At first, I didn't think much of it. The extra income helped a lot with supporting our family. But then, I started meeting some of her coworkers, and I couldn't shake the bad vibes, especially from the guys she worked with. To be blunt, a lot of them struck me as sleazy types, and a few were even known to be heavy into drugs. Then there was Jessica's friend Angela, who had helped her get the job. Angela was married to Ryan, a small-time dealer and the guy we'd go to when we wanted a fix. Angela and Ryan had a stormy relationship, constantly fighting and cheating on each other. I'd even heard rumors they were into swinging, though I never got involved. Ryan could be an alright guy, but once he got too deep into the whiskey, he'd turn into a nightmare. I kept my distance, but Jessica and Angela hit it off, so we ended up spending a lot of time at their place. The first time I really started to suspect something was up with Jessica was on New Year's Eve. We went to this big party at Ryan and Angela's place, a typical end-of-the-year bash with plenty of beer and plenty of smoke. I hadn't touched weed in about 8 weeks, so it hit me hard. I was fine until just after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I downed nearly a whole bottle on top of the dozen or so beers I'd already had, and it made me as sick as a dog. I remember sitting out on the driveway, barely conscious, and it was a freezing night. After a while, Jessica found me out there, sick as anything, and dragged me inside. She laid me on a bed, and I passed out cold. I must have been out for a couple of hours because the next thing I remember, one of their teenage daughters was waking me up in her room. I stumbled out into the den, looking for Jessica, but she was nowhere to be found. I thought I heard some muffled sounds coming from a back bedroom, but I was too out of it to do much about it. By morning, I found myself on the den floor, and Jessica was sleeping on the couch. After that night, I swore I'd never let myself get that messed up again. I had a good career going, and I could sense that society was turning away from tolerance for recreational drugs. It was the "just say no" era, and as stories of the dangers of drug use spread, I cut back on drinking a lot and almost completely quit smoking pot. I stopped keeping it around the house, and within the year, I'd weaned myself off it altogether. I really believed Jessica was in it with me, but it started to dawn on me that she'd just stopped using at home. The first clear sign that something had shifted came in the spring. Jessica went to get a haircut one day and came back as a blonde. I also noticed she was shedding some of the weight she'd put on after having the kids, but I hadn't seen her on any diet or exercise plan that would explain it. Along with her weight loss and new hair color, which, honestly, I wasn't a fan of, she began wearing a different wardrobe, one that was noticeably more revealing. When I finally brought up her new look, she just shrugged it off, saying something about wanting to look nice for work. It didn't sit right with me, though. As spring rolled into summer, she started going out with the girls a couple of nights a week after work, coming home later each time. Many nights, she'd slip in quietly, head straight to the bathroom, lock the door, and take a shower as soon as she got home. Our intimate life became non-existent. At first, it bothered me, later, I'd come to feel relieved it had. Then, one night in mid-July, she stumbled in around 2 a.m., and I pretended to be asleep, watching her from the corner of my eye. She slipped off her dress, and to my shock, she had nothing on underneath. That was the first real, undeniable clue that made me suspect she was cheating. The next morning, I confronted her, and she met my gaze, flat out denying it. "Of course, I'm not having an affair," she said, acting offended. "Are you?" she shot back. "Not even close," I replied, but her response said it all. She was taking the offended angle, flipping my suspicions back on me. I knew I'd been faithful, though I'd had my share of temptation from women at work. But I knew better than to go down that road, so I always avoided those situations. It's not that I was some paragon of loyalty who'd never consider stepping outside my marriage if the opportunity arose. It was more about my nature. I wasn't great with charming strangers, and I'd never mastered the art of smooth talking. I felt at home with Jessica, trying to go out with someone else would have felt out of character for me. At home, things grew chillier between us, and the distance was palpable. Our intimacy was a joke, and the light-hearted banter we once had was nowhere to be found. I'd get on her case when she came home a bit too late, her eyes bloodshot and the familiar smell of marijuana lingering on her. Once again, she turned it around on me, saying she was old enough to do as she pleased. She reminded me I'd been the one to introduce her to that lifestyle and said if I wasn't willing to keep up, she'd find someone who would. As September neared its end, I made one last effort to save what was left of our relationship. I managed to catch Jessica on one of her days off, had her sit down, and we talked. I told her I was well aware of how much more she'd been smoking pot and that I suspected she might be using harder stuff. I asked her if she still loved me and if she still wanted to be married to me. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she did. "All right, then, I have a few conditions," I told her. "I want you to quit that job and find something else. I think it'd be a good idea if you looked into rehab, and I want us to see a marriage counselor together. I'm willing to let the past go, but only if you're willing to meet me halfway." "I don't know, Adam," she said. "I make good money there, and I like working there. They treat me well, and I'm definitely not going into rehab. I get if you're done with it, but I'm not ready to quit. I'm not a junkie or anything, I can handle it." She did agree to counseling, and we went twice. But after that, she decided it was a waste of both time and money we couldn't afford, so she stopped going. Soon, her pattern of reckless behavior started up again. I even found myself following her to the bars she'd go to after work, where she'd drink with a mix of men and women. Some of those places were downright sketchy. I never stayed long, just enough to see if she was leaving for motels or anything, since I had to get back home to the kids. But a few times, I saw her slip toward the back of the bar, heading for the restrooms, and she'd be back there way longer than seemed necessary for whatever women usually do in the ladies' room. By December, I'd gathered enough circumstantial evidence that I was ready to go further and get something concrete. By then, our marriage was a sham. We were constantly fighting, and she was coming home late from work nearly every other night, looking like she'd been put through the ringer. I'd had it with Jessica and her pattern of lies and infidelities. Worse still, she had all but abandoned the role of mother, spending her time out partying rather than being home. I was handling most of the parenting, and believe me, the kids noticed her absence. I needed to know exactly what she was up to so I could figure out my next move, whether there was any chance left for our marriage or if it was time to file for divorce. I took 3 steps right off the bat. First, I went to see my doctor for a regular checkup and discreetly asked for a blood test. I wanted to confirm 2 things: 1, that I didn't have any STDs, and 2, that I was completely drug-free. Next, I quietly collected samples from each of our 3 kids and sent them to a DNA lab out of state. I needed undeniable proof of whether or not I was truly their father. DNA testing wasn't quite as advanced back then as it is now, but it was reliable enough to give me an answer. I didn't think the results would change how I felt about them. They were my kids, no matter what. But legally, if divorce came up, I planned to go for custody, and my chances would be a lot better if I was their biological father. Finally, I asked around and got in touch with the best divorce lawyer in town and met with him. I laid out the whole situation, and he agreed to take me on as a client. He also referred me to a private investigator. Greg Baker was a no-nonsense guy in his early 40s, someone who seemed to know just about everyone in town and every bit of news there was to know. I explained what I needed, and he took the case. The costs were already stacking up, and I didn't even have any solid proof yet. Everything came to a head on Christmas Eve. Jessica's company had a tradition of closing around 1 p.m. on Christmas Eve and throwing a big party in their warehouse for the employees. I figured Jessica would celebrate for a couple of hours, then come home so we could finish up some last-minute shopping and set up the Santa gifts for the kids, ready for their early morning excitement on Christmas. But 7 p.m. rolled by with no sign of her. Then 9 p.m. came and went, and still no Jessica. I started making calls, Angela, who was also out of touch, the local jails, hospitals, but I couldn't track her down. I was fuming. She couldn't even tone down her behavior on Christmas Eve. I was still waiting for her around 10:30 when I heard a car door slam. She stumbled up the walkway, and the moment she saw me standing there, her face dropped. She tried to push past me, but I stopped her, and the smell hit me. She reeked of sweat and sex. I could even see dried evidence in her hair, and her eyes were glassy, like she'd spent the day getting high. I looked at her, and she avoided my eyes. Something in me just gave way at that moment. I was too worn out to fight with her right then. Besides, I knew I'd soon have video proof of her actions because I'd had a hunch she might pull something like this, so I'd had Greg set up surveillance. Greg had already found out that Jessica had been seen frequently at a cheap motel on the rough side of town with some shady types. He'd bribed a motel clerk and arranged for a hidden camera to be planted in one of the rooms, with instructions that if Jessica showed up, she'd be directed to that room along with whoever she was with. Jessica and I spent a tense Christmas day barely speaking, both of us on edge while I waited for the inevitable fallout. It felt like the quiet before the storm. I knew her office was closed for the week between Christmas and New Year's, so at least I didn't have to worry about her slipping off to work. But then, the day after Christmas, I got an urgent call from Greg while I was at the store. "You need to come see the tape from the other day," he said, his tone serious. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Worse than anything you could imagine," he replied. I had suspected Jessica might have a boyfriend or two on the side, but nothing prepared me for what I was about to see. Greg had me sit down in one of his associates' empty offices, popped the tape into the VCR, and left me alone to absorb what was on it. Before starting the tape, he handed me a surveillance report detailing Jessica's behavior leading up to her arrival at the motel. The report alone was damning. That report was nearly enough proof by itself, graphic as it was. Somehow, Greg had managed to get an associate into Jessica's company party, giving me a first-hand account of what went down. It started off as a typical holiday bash, lots of drinking and some playful mistletoe kisses. Nothing too outrageous. But after an hour, the Christmas carols faded out, replaced by upbeat dance music, and Jessica started dancing provocatively with a few others, including her friend Angela. According to the report, Jessica and Angela practically put on a show in the middle of the room, surrounded by cheering men. Then things took a darker turn. Jessica was spotted heading out to the parking lot with a man. Greg's associate positioned himself so he could see what they were up to. First, they lit a joint, and as they smoked, he pulled out a vial, and they shared several spoonfuls of coke. Afterward, Jessica's head dropped into the guy's lap, and the associate saw the man's head tilt back, a look of pleasure crossing his face. A few minutes later, Jessica's head came back up, and she wiped her mouth with a wicked grin before they returned to the party. By around 6 p.m., the gathering was winding down, but instead of coming home, Jessica followed a group of pickups to the familiar motel. That's when the tape started rolling. My wife, my supposed partner, walked into a room with 4 men who looked like they'd had rough lives. They were all tall, well-built, and maybe even considered good-looking if you liked the rough-around-the-edges type. Inside, 3 joints were lit up and passed around while one of the men prepared several thick lines of coke on a table. As the room filled with smoke, each person, including Jessica, took a line up each nostril, and she laughed flirtatiously after hers. Then things escalated. What I saw on that tape made every explicit movie I'd ever heard about seem mild. Jessica's behavior with those men was so intense it was practically professional level. I'd seen more than enough, but I fast-forwarded just to get a sense of how far it went, and it did get worse. By the time she took on all 4 men at once, I was too numb to feel any fresh shock. Apparently, the look on my face said it all, because Paul Simmons, the associate who tailed Jessica at the party, took me to a nearby bar for a drink afterward. After a couple of beers, I felt slightly better. We talked about my next steps, and he agreed to back me up when the time came to serve Jessica with divorce papers. Paul, a big, muscular guy with a surprisingly soft heart, understood exactly what I was going through. He'd been through a similar situation himself and sympathized with me. That night, I barely managed to stay civil with Jessica when I got home. Thankfully, she made it easy by dressing up and heading out with her friends. I didn't even bother watching her leave. I was busy playing with Ava in the den. The next morning, I went straight to my lawyer and told him I was ready to file for divorce. I wanted the papers to be prepared by New Year's Eve, with Paul serving them to her. It was my New Year's surprise for my loyal wife. On New Year's Eve, I told Jessica I'd be working until the store closed at 9 p.m. and that I wanted to keep things low-key at home. I asked her to stay in with me, fully aware she wouldn't. Just as I expected, she was planning to go to Angela and Ryan's party, and she laughed at what she assumed was my pathetic attempt to guilt-trip her into staying. "If you want to be a stick in the mud, that's on you," she said. "But I'm going out to party. Can't you at least wait until I'm home so you can keep an eye on the kids?" I asked. "Why should I let the little rugrats ruin my night?" she sneered. "Get a sitter if you're so tied up at that store and can't take care of your precious little darlings." Her words stunned me. I knew she'd checked out of parenting, but hearing her speak so coldly about the kids was a gut punch. It made what happened next all the more surreal. "That's fine, Jessica," I said, taking my time with each word. "I'll handle everything. Don't worry about lifting a finger for your children." I called the teenage girl next door, who was our regular sitter, and asked her to watch the kids for about an hour. She agreed, and I instructed her to call the store as soon as Jessica left the house. A little after 7:30, the sitter called, and I handed over the store to my assistant. I had arranged for my brother to meet me at the house, and his wife picked up the kids, taking them to spend the night with their grandparents. With my brother's help, we packed up every one of Jessica's belongings and loaded them into my pickup, then took everything to a storage facility. By 10 p.m., we headed over to Angela and Ryan's place, where Paul was parked nearby, keeping an eye on things. "She hasn't left," Paul said as I approached. "Looks like she's planning to stay all night." "Perfect," I replied, as he handed me a cup of coffee from his thermos. We sat and watched the house as people came and went, waiting until midnight. As fireworks and cheers filled the air, we stepped out of the car and approached the house. At first, no one answered the door, probably because the music and noise were so loud. But Paul knocked hard, and eventually, someone I didn't recognize opened it. "Jessica Turner," Paul announced loudly as we walked into the foyer. It took a few minutes, but finally, someone fetched her to the door. She looked completely out of it, her eyes glazed and unfocused. "Yeah, what?" she started, but then she spotted me and my brother standing beside Paul. Judging by the look on her face, she knew right away that we weren't there to join the festivities. "What are you?" she began, but Paul cut her off. "Jessica Turner," he announced as he slapped a letter into her hand. "You are served. This is a petition filed in civil court by Mr. Adam Peterson, requesting a divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. Included here is also a court order barring you from coming within 1,600 feet of the residence you once shared with Mr. Peterson. Inside this envelope, you'll find a key and the address to a storage facility where your belongings are now located." "You sorry son of a," she sputtered, and I saw Angela, Ryan, and a crowd of their friends beginning to gather behind her. "I gave you a chance, Jessica," I said calmly. "I gave you the opportunity to turn things around, and you chose to cheat. You made your choices, now deal with them." As their angry murmuring grew louder, Paul opened his jacket, revealing the pistol tucked into his belt. He placed his hand on the grip and stared down the crowd. Without another word, we turned and walked out as the door slammed behind us. I doubted Paul would have used the gun, but it certainly kept things peaceful on our way out. Afterward, I headed to my parents' place to spend what was left of New Year's Eve and prepare for the storm that was surely coming. The storm didn't take long to hit. Jessica managed to make a mess of things right out of the gate, kicking off what would be a year from hell. While we were packing her things, I'd hired a locksmith to change the locks on the house. But that didn't stop her. On New Year's Day, while I was at my parents' house, Jessica smashed a kitchen window to break into the house and ransacked our bedroom. I don't know what she was searching for, if anything, but I called the police and had her charged with breaking and entering. Since it was her first arrest and happened the day after being served, her lawyer managed to get the charges dropped. A week later, I got my blood test results back from the doctor and felt a huge relief when they came up negative for any diseases. I added those results to the evidence file I was building. Then came more good news. The DNA results confirmed that all 3 kids were indeed mine. Whatever Jessica had been up to, she'd started after our children were born. That made things simpler for me. I planned to fight for full custody and only offer her supervised visitation. To my surprise, Jessica fought everything tooth and nail. Given her recent behavior, I thought she'd be glad to have her freedom, that she'd welcome the chance to do whatever she wanted without a family tying her down. But it seemed I underestimated the demons my dad had sensed in her all those years ago. Once I became the enemy in her mind, she wasn't going to let me win without a struggle. Yet every time she tried to fight back, it seemed to backfire on her and made her even angrier. One of those incidents ended in another arrest for marijuana possession, leading to a hefty fine and a 6-month suspension of her driver's license. By midsummer, I finally secured the divorce. We went to court over custody, and she pulled out what she thought was her trump card, the fact that I'd introduced her to drugs in the first place. But my lawyer countered with my clean drug test results and evidence showing I'd been drug-free for nearly a year. It looked like I was going to win full custody. Then Jessica crossed the line. It was a sweltering night in September, and I was just leaving the store. All I heard was the scuffle of feet, then a heavy object, maybe a bat or a thick stick, came down hard on my ribs. I barely managed to roll away from a second swing aimed at my head, which ended up glancing off my shoulder. I managed to get up onto my knees to defend myself and realized I was facing 3 attackers, 2 of whom I recognized from Jessica's Christmas Eve escapade on the tape. I focused on the guy swinging the club, blocking him enough to keep him from landing any serious blows. I even managed to get in a few solid hits to his midsection. But while I was dealing with him, I left myself open to the fists and kicks of the other 2. I don't know if they'd have killed me, but I faintly heard voices calling out from down the street, and the attackers backed off, leaving me crumpled on the ground in pain. The last thing I remember was a kid leaning over me, asking if I was okay, then calling for help. The next thing I knew, I was looking up at a face, a woman's face. At first, it was a blur, but as I came to, I realized she was a nurse, and a beautiful one at that. She had a slim face that lit up with a smile as I became more alert, and when she smiled, her whole face seemed to glow. That's how I met Claire Roberts. I ended up staying in the hospital for 4 weeks, and during that time, I got to know Claire well. She was, quite simply, the most stunning woman I'd ever seen. Her name fit her perfectly. She had a quiet grace about her, a poise that seemed to come from an inner peace. She was slightly taller than average, slender, with soft blonde hair just brushing her shoulders. She wasn't particularly curvy, but if that bothered her, she never showed it, and it certainly didn't bother me. Right from the start, there was a connection between us, and we'd talk whenever she came by to check on me. I found her to be an amazing listener with wisdom well beyond her years. She was about a year older than me and had never been married or even come close to it. She mentioned she'd had a few boyfriends, but none had really made her heart race. Then she flashed me that incredible smile and gave me a playful wink. While I was in the hospital, the police visited me several times, and it became clear that Jessica had been behind the attack. For reasons I couldn't fully understand, she and her friends ended up being arrested and charged with attempted murder. I let her stew in it until the start of the new year before meeting with her to propose a deal. If you give up any claim to custody, I'll work on getting the charges reduced to aggravated assault. Why should I do anything for you? She sneered. Because I don't think you want to spend the next 16 years in prison, I replied. I'm offering you the choice between 3 to 7 years with a chance of seeing the kids from time to time or 16 to life with no chance at all. Don't make the same mistake you did when you turned down my offer to work on our marriage. Remember, I was willing to forgive everything you'd done up to that point. If you'd quit your job, gotten into rehab, and taken counseling seriously, none of this would have happened. But you refused, and look where that's gotten you. You're jobless, still hooked, and about to become a convicted felon. You don't have anything on me, she said defiantly. Oh, really? I sneered. I'm done being Jessica's doormat. You should hear what your friends are telling the cops. They're saying you hired them to beat me up, that you wanted me dead. They're turning on you, Jessica, and your only shot now is to take a deal. I could see her shoulders slump as the reality set in. In the end, she agreed to a deal with the DA, pleading guilty to aggravated assault, which meant a sentence of 3 to 7 years. I was finally free of her in every practical sense. But I was left financially drained and emotionally exhausted. I had no choice but to sell the house and move back to my parents' place with the kids. My mom was an absolute blessing, helping care for the children and doing her best to ease their worries. After being discharged from the hospital, I still had 2 more months of rehab ahead, leaving me unable to work. My company's insurance and workers' comp covered most of my expenses, but as the new year approached, they needed a store manager on site. Compared to the chaos of the previous year, New Year's in 2004 was a relief, though it underscored just how lonely I felt. The woman I'd thought I loved, the mother of my children, had turned into an enemy and had shattered her own life along with mine. Money was tight, and I couldn't do as much for the kids as I wanted. I was still dealing with some physical pain, and the weight of everything that had happened over the past 19 months was sinking me into a depression. Then things took a turn for the worse. Right after the new year, the company I'd been with gave me a tough choice: either take a manager position in another state or accept a layoff. Neither option appealed to me, so I handed in my resignation and took a floor position at a big retail store. It was a step down from being a manager, and the pay wasn't nearly as good. In a lot of ways, it felt like starting my career all over again. But the work was easy, and the hours were flexible, letting me be home in the evenings with my kids. I found a small house to rent, and we moved out of my parents' place. It was in a lower-end neighborhood and didn't have much charm, but at least it was our own space. That winter of 2006 was probably the lowest point of my life. The only upside was that I resisted the pull of drugs and alcohol. Watching Jessica's life unravel had taught me better, though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted at times. Then, for the second time, an angel came into my life. It was a Saturday, and I was in the grocery store with the kids, who were being a bit of a handful. By then, they were 9, 7, and 6, good kids, but still young and full of energy. I was trying to calm Tyler down, who was really acting up, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Adam Peterson. I turned and saw Claire approaching. We hugged, and then she knelt down to greet each of the kids by name. I was floored. She'd only met them once or twice, yet she remembered each of their names and ages. That was the first time I saw her natural gift with kids. They settled down right away. We chatted, and she genuinely wanted to know how I was holding up. Then, almost at the same moment, we looked up and met each other's gaze. Just for an instant, but in that one moment, I think we both sensed a spark. Would you like to go to dinner sometime? I asked, a bit unsure. I owe you for all the kindness you showed me when I was in the hospital. Adam, I was just doing my job, Claire said, smiling. But I'd love to. Do you have plans for tonight? I must have looked a bit surprised. Later on, as I got to know her better, I'd realized that's just how she is, direct and to the point, without a lot of pretense. We exchanged numbers, and she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. It was nothing much, but it gave me goosebumps. And, of course, little Ava picked up on it right away. As we finished up our shopping, Ava blurted out, "Is she going to be our new mommy?" "Oh, I don't know, sweetheart," I replied. "It's way too early to say." "Why, would you like her to be?" Oh, yes, she said, beaming. What about you two? I asked Emily and Tyler. Think you could see Miss Claire as your new mom? Sure, Dad, Tyler said. She's pretty cool. We'll see, I laughed. It's early yet, and she might have her own opinion on the matter. But you do like her, don't you, Daddy? Emily asked in her usual thoughtful way. Yeah, I do, I said. But let's take things one step at a time. That night, I took Claire to a steakhouse, a nice, comfortable place with good food and a relaxed vibe. During that dinner, I learned that Claire was everything Jessica wasn't. I can't say she's perfect, she has her moments, like anyone else. But I've never met someone with such a sunny outlook and positive attitude. With Jessica, there was always this cloud hanging overhead, a constant worry about things beyond her control. She was often weighed down by regret and remorse, and it tended to drag me down too. With Claire, though, each day felt like a fresh start. She's forward-thinking, a planner, and doesn't waste time dwelling on the past. Once a day is done, she leaves it behind. It didn't take long before we both knew we were falling in love. After about 8 weeks of dating, I took Claire to meet my family, and they were genuinely impressed. My dad, in fact, took one look at her and told me to do whatever it took to keep her in my life. The kids, of course, fell for Claire almost as fast as I did, and she stepped right into the role of a loving, surrogate mother. As summer went on, we grew closer and more affectionate, though we both held off on sex at first. After my past with Jessica, I was nervous about letting myself go emotionally and physically. Claire, too, wasn't one for casual relationships. When I make love with you, I want it to be a commitment of love, she told me one evening as we sat together on the sofa after dinner at my place. I believe you're that man, Adam, but until you're ready to take that final step with me, I'll wait. God, Claire, I want you more than I can say, I replied. But hearing you put love and intimacy together like that means the world to me after what I went through with Jessica. Soon, my love, she whispered, and then she kissed me deeply, making her feelings clear. About a week later, I went to my mom and told her I planned to ask Claire to marry me. She did something she'd never done for Jessica, likely because of the way that marriage had come about. She went to her room, opened her jewelry box, and took out her engagement ring. With tears in her eyes, she handed it to me. Give this to her with all my blessings, she said. It's not a big, fancy diamond, just a small stone in a simple setting, but I believe this ring will mean far more to her than something new and expensive. There's a lot of love in this ring, and I want her to have it. She's the best thing that's happened to you, and I want her to know it. I decided to wait until Christmas Eve to propose. We planned to spend Christmas morning at my parents' place with the kids, who'd be with their cousins and grandparents. I picked Claire up after work, then we went to my folks' place to get the kids for the Christmas Eve service at Claire's church, where I'd started attending as well. Claire sang in the choir, and I couldn't help but gaze into her eyes as they sang, feeling more in love than ever. Later, we finally got the kids settled down, a feat in itself, and set up the Santa gifts. Once everything was in place, I told my folks that we'd be heading back to my house. I gave my mom a quick wink, and she knew what was coming. At home, I turned on the Christmas tree lights and put on some holiday music. We sat together on the sofa, and I quietly slipped the ring box out from between the cushions. Claire, I have a special Christmas gift for you, and I'd like you to open it now, I said softly. I handed her the box, and when she opened it, her eyes went wide, and a look of pure joy crossed her face. Claire, will you marry me? Her response was to cover me in kisses. Our hands roamed, and this time, we didn't hold back. Our moment had arrived. I've been waiting for this for so long, she whispered. Love me, Adam. Believe me, I've been waiting even longer. We made love, and afterward, I held her close, and we stared into each other's eyes, our feelings flowing between us without a word. Merry Christmas, my love, she whispered. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I answered back. Claire and I were married in our church in mid-March, and we've shared nearly 16 years of happiness. My children soon became hers in every way that mattered, and they took to their new mom with open hearts and minds, as naturally as ducks to water. There have only been two shadows over our life together since Claire and I married. The first was that Claire couldn't have a child of her own. We tried everything, but eventually, the doctors discovered a problem with her uterus. True to her nature, Claire didn't dwell on it. Instead, she poured all her love into raising the children we already had, never letting her misfortune hold her back. The second challenge came about 6 years into our marriage when, out of the blue, I got a call from Jessica. She told me that she'd contracted HIV years earlier and was now dying of AIDS. After serving over 3 years in prison, she'd ended up on the streets, surviving by any means she could. Now she was in a hospice and wanted to see the children one last time. I dreaded the visit, but surprisingly, Jessica had made peace with herself, and with me. She no longer blamed me for what had gone wrong in her life. She even forgave me for my own mistakes during our marriage, and I found myself able to forgive her for everything she'd put me through. After meeting with the kids, Jessica asked to speak with Claire privately. When Claire emerged, she was in tears. On the drive home, Claire told me some of what they had discussed. "She told me not to let you go," Claire said quietly. "Jessica said her biggest regret was not taking you up on the chance to save your marriage. She finally realized that you'd given her an out, and she let it slip away. That's why she was so bitter during the divorce." In her final act, Jessica consented to let Claire adopt the children. For years, she'd resisted it, but in the end, she did the right thing, giving Claire the opportunity to truly be their mother. With Claire beside me, I was able to rebuild my life. I worked my way back up into management, eventually climbing into a corporate role. Today, I'm a regional director for a major company, and life has been good. Claire is still a pediatric nurse, using her incredible gifts to care for children in need. Some cases break her heart, others ignite her passion for justice, but she finds deep fulfillment in her work. My oldest daughter, Emily, was so inspired by Claire that she decided to pursue a career in nursing. Tyler joined the Army National Guard right after high school and is now in college. I worry about the possibility of him being called up, but it's his choice, and I fully support him. Ava, my youngest, is in college and hopes to become a teacher. It's been a rewarding life, one I don't think I would have had if Claire hadn't come into my life when she did. Father Christmas has left gifts under the tree, and Claire sits beside me, nestled comfortably in my arms. Bing Crosby's White Christmas plays softly in the background, and we gaze into the cozy glow of the fireplace. I take a final sip from my glass and set it down on the coffee table. Tomorrow will be full of laughter and joy as we open presents, each one carefully chosen with love. We'll gather in the kitchen, cooking together and enjoying the company of family. It will be a day filled with happiness, as it always is. But tonight, on this quiet Christmas Eve, I reflect on the greatest gift of my life, the one that keeps giving. Tonight, I'm thankful for the love and devotion of a truly remarkable woman and for the deep love I've been able to give in return. Grace is another word for elegance, but it's also an unearned gift, a blessing from above. That's exactly what Claire is to me, a gift of grace. Thank you for watching this story of betrayal and second chances. Do you think Adam made the right choices? Share your thoughts in the comments below.